Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this, the second in our series on the major economic challenges, based on the work for the Macron Commission. We are this week and next looking at three big challenges with some of the experts who contributed to that remarkable piece of work. Yesterday, we looked at inequality. Next week, we're going to look at demography. But today, we're looking at climate change. And I'm delighted that we're joined today by Reguant and by Christian Gollier. They are both economists working on the economics of climate change. They wrote, or they were authors of the climate change chapter in the Tyrol Blanchard Commission. Is Associate Professor of Economics at Northwestern, though she's currently based in Barcelona, and she's an expert in the economics of energy in particular. Christian Gollier is Managing Director of the Toulouse School of Economics. He's been an author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports and is President of the European Association of Environmental Economists. Between them, they bring an enormous amount of expertise and experience to this topic. They're going to speak for, and I think on a sort of double header, they're going to speak for about 40 minutes or so between them. We'll then have plenty of time for questions. So do put your questions into the Slido app, for which you should have the link, and vote for questions that you want me to ask, because the more votes they get, the higher up the list they will come. I should just say one final word. I'm really pleased that we're doing this piece on climate change. Ever since I was involved with the Stern report about 15 years ago, it's been one of my great interests. And as a member of the UK Climate Change Committee, something that I'm particularly interested in hearing more analysis of, and your, as viewers of this, your questions and input into. But let me hand over now to Mar and Christian. And as I say, please do put questions into the Slido app as we go and after they've finished.
And thank you, Paul. I will be first. I will cover the first part, the first 20 minutes of the presentation. So it's no time to explain that we have a climate urgency here. We are strong about that in the report, but I don't think we need to spend time convincing people here around to say there is an urgency and we need to do something very fast. And in particular, although we know that we have a climate challenge, we knew that over the last 30 years, we are still increasing, and we are not reducing our emissions. So it's becoming critically important. We need to do that in a world where there is some discrepancies between belief and reality. In particular, for example, not everything green is desirable. There are costs and benefits associated to different action, and it's critically important for social acceptability that we start with the least cost effort. We live in a world where many people continue to believe that we can at the same time face our responsibility toward future generation and reduce the electric bill and create millions of good jobs. In fact, the reality is we need to eliminate fossil fuel that made the prosperity of our Western world for the last 2 centuries by something that becoming cheaper, but in many dimensions remain expensive and difficult to manage. I think here about the electricity intermittency of renewables. Mar will say a little bit more than what I do here, what I see here in a few minutes. So there is also a reluctance to impose the preferred tools of economists, which is a carbon pricing. People don't like taxes; they prefer subsidies. But we know as economists that the subsidies given to X is a tax for Y, and so we cannot solve the problem entirely with subsidies, in particular given the level of the public debts. And also, we try to make clearer in the chapter that indeed, if the consequence of the transition is to increase the price of the cost of energy, that will be regressive, because the income elasticity of the demand for energy is smaller than one. Poorer people devote a larger fraction of their budget to energy, and therefore increasing that the price of energy is regressive. We believe that with the carbon tax or carbon pricing system, we can completely eliminate this regressivity. In fact, combining fighting climate change with fighting inequalities in societies, in particular by focusing the distribution of the carbon dividend to the more modest households. So we propose in the document really an holistic strategy, which is not limited to carbon pricing. We believe that there are other externalities and other market failures that require to be solved at the same time than as the climate externality. And also we believe that in this world, it's better to do the decision at the largest possible level, that is for Europe, that's the European Union. I'm sorry for the people in the UK with your Brexit, but at least for the French and for the Spanish here, we believe the French policy or the Spanish policy is the second best compared to thinking the problem at the level of the unions. And also we stress the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty in front of us in this energy transition, which will have radical impact on our way of life or the way we produce, and therefore we have a risk management issue associated to that. So we need politicians with a clear vision. We need decision makers and people empowered to solve the problem, to propose a clear vision. The report try to help in that dimension. Mark, could you change the slide, please? Yes, very quickly here we have EU targets. So we take the targets as given. We don't do what Stern did. I mean, we say we agree. I mean, we have the 55% reduction by the year 2030 and zero net emission by the year 2050. Let us take that seriously and let us see what are the policies that need to be implemented to get there. We don't spend much time asking whether those targets are the right one or not. I mean, it's not the time anymore to talk about that. Those targets are very ambitious for Europe. Same thing for the UK. I mean, this is extremely ambitious. So we need to combine different policies in order to get there. We need to have carbon pricing. We need to subsidize different investment technologies. We need to do, of course, given the current technologies, the cost of the transition remain too high and problematic in terms of social acceptability. So we need to reduce the cost of abatement, and therefore we need to provide the support to research and development. We will have to impose bans and norms and standards in different sectors. Those strategies probably dominate are complementary to carbon pricing and many other things specific to different sectors confronted with specific market failure that we need to address on top of carbon pricing. So to give you, and moreover, of course, Europe remain too small. European Union represents 9% of the global emission. So we also need to think of what European policies could help export our ambition to other regions of the world. Keep in mind that if we just take the existing commitment in the Paris Agreement and we say Europe have to do everything to get to the 2 degrees Celsius target, the effort that will have to be done by Europe is extremely difficult. I mean, you see on the right-hand side of this slide the the red curve gives you the path of reduction of CO2 in percentage compared to 2015 that is compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius. So if Europe is the residual claimant in terms of what should be done to remain under the 2 degrees Celsius, I mean, you see that by the year 2032 or something like that, Europe will already have to be negative emission. Now, so big picture, there is a myriad of climate action that need to be performed by a myriad of agents. So there is an issue related to how to reorganize society in a free market world. How should we reorganize the structure of the society in order to make sure that this society will be able to reduce emission at the level that is necessary to confront our responsibility toward future generation. So again, not all green actions are socially desirable. We should start with the least costly actions, and that's critically important if we want to confront the yellow vest people, for example, in France, but probably in Europe too, given what has been announced in July in terms of climate policies in the Green Deal. So the idea to go to the least cost is to measure for each possible action those actions that have the smaller cost per ton of CO2 saved, and so we need to make those computations and to put a cutoff cost to determine which action are in the short term socially desirable to perform and which action should be postponed to the future. So we need to have a carbon value, which is this cutoff cost of per ton of CO2 saved, and that's and this carbon value should be compatible with the global carbon budget or the politically decided emission target for the Union. So if all mitigation acts that cost less than the carbon value are implemented, then the politically determined target should be attained. So that's the idea. So what carbon value are compatible with this target, 55 in 2030 and 100% by the year 2050? Well, there is a debate about that. So in France, we are lucky enough that in France, and I know in the UK too, but in France we have the Kiné2 Commission, which published in 2019 a report that propose a path for the carbon price that is compatible with the target. And the idea is to have something like 80 euros per ton of CO2 today, going up to 300 euros per the year 2030 and something like 800 euros by the year 2050. So that's give us an idea. Of course, in particular for the carbon price by the year 2050, it strongly depends upon what technology will be available at that time, but that gives you an idea. And so the first point we make in the report is that, okay, we should do other things than carbon pricing. We need to go to ban standard subsidies, but we need to, for each of these policies, climate policies, we need to do a cost-benefit analysis. And to say the least, in Europe and in France, those cost-benefit analyses are not perfectly done. Mark, next slide. So here, I will have no time to talk about that much, but here is an illustration of different policies to reduce emission. On the bottom of each square, you have an estimation, a crude estimation of the cost per ton of CO2 saved. And the idea is to start working on all the actions and measures for each of them, a cost per ton of CO2 saved. And that may be very difficult. For example, in France, we did at the Ministry of Ecology in the year 2017, I think, they estimated the cost per ton of CO2 saved to reduce speed limit on the highways. For example, for highways from 200 130 kilometers per hour to 110. But of course, you see the difficulty of doing that is you not only have benefits in terms of CO2, but you also have benefits in terms of reductions of cost of energy, life saved on the road, but spend lost time lost to go from point A to point B. So you need to do this cost benefit analysis, but we know in the UK many good economists are doing that, and so that's the idea is to expand that. Sorry, is it? Yeah, that's me, but I don't know how to cut that. Okay, that's over. So in order, I'm sorry, I'm here in the Banque de France. I had another conference, keynote lecture I did there, and so I don't know how to cut this, but it's a phone call that it should stop soon. How can we go from carbon value to a carbon price? So the idea is, in order to have all those policies implemented that are socially desirable, making sure that everybody having an action that has a cost per ton of CO2 smaller than the cost, the cutoff cost, we just have to put a price on carbon, and everybody who emits CO2 should have to pay that price. And if the price of carbon is equal to this carbon value, which is compatible with the climate target, then we have an incentive scheme to make sure that everybody does what should be done. Well, that's a consensus among economies that what should be done. So a universal carbon price, the price should be equal for all emitters. It's a polluter pay principle. That's nothing else than that. So the unicity of price is key, no exemption. We can solve the inequality issue. Mar will say more about that in a minute. Rather than having a tax system, a carbon tax, we think that in Europe, that's not big news, but we think that in Europe, it's easier to implement a carbon pricing system through a market for allowances. Yes, so specifically on carbon pricing, which is one big element of the report. We support, in fact, most of the things that have been proposed by the European Commission on July the 14th. Our report was published in June. We didn't anticipate what was proposed by the Commission. It was secret at the time we published our report, but I have been particularly happy to see what has been proposed by the Commission. For example, we propose to extend the scope of the EU ETS, which currently cover only electricity and industry, and we propose to expand this market to the other sectors, in particular transportation and the building sector. The Commission proposed something else, probably because of social acceptability problem, given the large price of carbon allowances on the EU ETS today, around 60 euros per ton of CO2, is probably difficult for many countries which did not implement the carbon pricing system for those other sectors to go immediately to 60 euros. So they propose to create a second ETS market for auto and building. But that's, at least it goes in the right direction. We hope that there will be in the negotiation and debate about what convergence mechanism between the two markets will be put in place. We are also happy to see that in this Fit for 55 project, there is a solution proposed for carbon leakage problem. This is this famous carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we support these things, and what we wrote in our report is very similar to what is proposed by the Commission. Of course, it's extremely important to replace that this mechanism of carbon adjustment is a substitute for free allowances. So we are very strong in saying we should eliminate free allowances if we put in place carbon border adjustment. In particular, if you want to go to the WTO, arguing that this CBAM mechanism is there for a level playing field solution to the carbon leakage problem. We are not. I'm disappointed in one dimension, is that I think that one of the difficulty of a market rather than a tax is that for the market the price is very uncertain. The carbon price for 2030, 2040, and 2050, nobody knows what it will be to get to the desirable outcome, and that put a lot of uncertainty on the shoulder of the entrepreneur. And so we propose in the report to put a price floor on carbon price. So we should put a carbon floor today, and that should be made transparent, and the rate of growth of that price should be also politically decided now for the next 20 years. So that's not discussed. That's not in the Fit for 55 today. That's too bad. And we also think that it would be, of course, many countries will, some countries will be more hurt by the carbon pricing, in particular if the carbon price goes to the desirable level than other countries. And so we need to think about redistributing the cost of the efforts from those who will be more hurt, in particular those countries with low marginal cost of abatement. I think here about Poland, which could easily replace coal by an alternative source of energy. And so, so that could be costly compared to France, for example. France, with the carbon price at 60 euros per ton of CO2, that will not change much the electricity mix in France. We are already almost decarbonized electricity mix, and so that, at least for this electricity market, electricity sector, imposing a carbon price of 60 euros will generate no cost for France, but high cost for Poland. And we need to think in the negotiation about the carbon price, in particular, hopefully a carbon floor. We need to think of a redistribution of the cost in order to make it acceptable for those low marginal abatement cost countries. I'm done, I think. Mar, I give you the floor, and I think I'm exactly on time.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Christian. So in the report, we also highlight other climate policies that, as Christian already mentioned, are hugely important to get this done at the pace at which we are hoping to get it done. So we cannot make justice into every single sector or kind of a strategy that we analyze, but we try to give an overview of some of them that are deemed crucially important, and probably among them the most important one are R&D subsidies. I will have an explicit slide on the role of R&D, but it is crucial to address the global problem, as we do need cleaner technologies that are cheaper and better in some ways, as we wrote in the report, to make fossil fuels irrelevant. That's a high bar, but it's kind of the bar if we want everyone, not just the countries that care or can afford to care about climate change. We need everyone on board, and the solution will eventually have to come again from making fossil fuels irrelevant. Let's see. On the public sector front, there's obviously a lot of coordination failures that come from such a brutal change in how we do things. So it will be needed, the effort from the public sector. Here it's kind of very difficult to guess what the best strategy will be, and also it's kind of very difficult to quantify if public sector initiatives will be enough given the ambition of what wants to be achieved. And here we kind of highlighted in the report that it's unlikely, even with the very ambitious direct investment plans that we might have from the public sector, it's unclear that that will be enough, emphasizing a bit more again the need for getting carbon pricing as well as public sector investment, because with public sector alone, it's really completely unclear that we can achieve the level of transformation that we need and kind of be able to pay for it in current time. On the private sector, there are many measures that can be kind of achieved. Some of them obviously come from regulation, but regulation of the private sector via standard norms or even bans is now more and more attractive, given that carbon pricing is not covering enough sectors yet, although hopefully soon enough, and given the need for speed. So we have seen already many bans on fossil fuel cars being announced by governments. Initially, they looked transgressive, and more they are kind of normal in Europe, definitely not in the United States, but in Europe it's becoming kind of accepted that we need to put a final end on fossil fuel small cars. There's many costs to these policies. They are hard to quantify, although they do tend to be more popular. So when thinking about this balance between political feasibility and the cost of these policies, this will be a very difficult task. In the report, we honestly do not have answers to exact policies that we think should be the best, but we do acknowledge that that's kind of a bit of a hard balance between how costly these policies are and the benefits. Again, some of them, by the pass of time, are becoming more and more accepted, but others, it will take some time. And here I'm thinking, for example, about the heating of the residential sector. It might involve bans as well, and indeed several countries or counties are already proposing bans to fossil fuel heating, but it will be kind of a bit of a transition, and it's again, it will be a difficult balance. With today's natural gas prices, all these balances we are talking about will come to life in like no time in this winter. So it will be a very important thing to pay attention to. How can we make this transition happen without all of these blowing back? In some ways, we can think of the very high natural gas prices as being an analog to extremely high carbon prices, and the tensions that will come out will kind of be a bit of a preview of things to come. I fear. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we can anticipate some of these difficulties already this summer, but probably even more this winter. In all of these policies, there is a challenge in which when you subsidize, especially with subsidies, when you subsidize some greener products, you are also incentivizing their consumption. And to the extent that these greener products also come with some emissions, that's something that we will have to deal with when designing these policies. One example could be better housing insulation. It will be crucial to face more extreme weather events, and it can help save emissions, but probably the engineering estimates are a bit too optimistic, because the minute you have more insulation, you can more comfortably live at home. So you might consume more energy because it's cheaper. So that's kind of a bit of a balance between what we call the rebound effect and all the benefits from this better insulation. So it's not necessarily something bad for the consumer. The consumer is using their air conditioning more because they can afford it more. But for emissions, it means that emissions don't go down as much as maybe the engineering estimates forecast. So it's kind of, again, this balance. There's also the issue of the water bed effect in the presence of a cap and trade market. If we subsidize some green policies, they might be kind of undoing some of the carbon price. This would be solved, by the way, with a floor on carbon pricing that would ensure that these water bed effects are not too large and that we still have a healthy carbon price. But it's not clear, again, what that floor price will be, although, again, the new Green Deal is making good progress there. Finally, any ban, any standard, or any norm will face a lot of resistance, sometimes from consumers themselves, and we have already talked about the yellow vest, but sometimes from the lobbyists themselves that might be a bit reluctant to this change. So in the report, we kind of describe some of these policies and then go into a bit of detail for some of them. So one of them is the electricity sector, before getting there, sorry, I forgot this slide. Before getting into the more specific sectors, I wanted to mention the issue of climate and inequalities that Christian already mentioned. So there's no question that climate change policy will tend to disproportionately affect the poor. Oftentimes we get a lot of publicity about the carbon pricing being regressive, but actually most subsidies to green technology are extremely regressive, more than a carbon price, because they tend to be adopted by the higher income households. This is, for example, already getting a lot of attention in California, where there's been a lot of solar expansion, which is great for climate, but these solar subsidies have gone to the very high income, so it's kind of generating tensions. Inequalities from climate change policy have two effects. Both of them are detrimental. One is the inequality in itself, but the other one is that they challenge the energy transition in itself. So if we don't manage to address these inequalities, the energy transition probably will not happen, cannot happen. So in the report, we talk about ways in which to address this, particularly focusing on carbon pricing and how the carbon dividend, in our opinion, should be explicitly used to address some of these inequities. Again, it's not only important because it can be highly unequal, but also because probably without those carbon dividends, the energy transition might not be viable. And we will see a lot of turmoil resulting from these higher energy prices. It's also important to highlight that the climate change impacts in themselves are highly uneven. And oftentimes we've been thinking about this in the cross-section of countries. Poorer countries tend to have much higher impacts from extreme weather events, but it's also true, and it will be very much true within countries. So it's a topic that explicitly was not part of the report because it would be too much to cover, but we highlight in the report that it's an area that should need more attention and more active policy making, because it's likely to gain a lot of importance. In the United States, there's been some recent extreme events, and we are already seeing quite a bit of this disproportionate impacts from hurricanes, fires, extreme temperatures, and so on and so forth. So let me get now into two specific sectors. We will talk about electricity and R&D. So electricity is kind of my area of study, and it's definitely a key sector for the decarbonization of our economy. Basically, a lot of the decarbonization strategy is to electrify everything. So even if we are making some progress, maybe not fast enough, but quite a bit of progress in decarbonizing the electricity grid as of now, if we consider that the electricity grid will need to expand to electrify many of the other sectors, we really need to put quite a bit of effort in making that decarbonization of the electricity sector. So it's not kind of a solved issue, and it will continue to be a challenge given that, again, we need to expand the electricity footprint. Renewables are already cost effective at scale, definitely now with a very high natural gas prices, but there are important political economy issues that make their rollout more expensive than it seems. And in particular, Europe is a relatively dense area, so it's quite difficult to place renewables and not have difficulties in the process. There's also the issue of renewable intermittency that Christian mentioned. Storage technologies are developing, but are not yet economical, so we'll definitely need to keep some fossil fuel units until that storage catches up. Nuclear is definitely a big topic in France, and we didn't quite fully address it, as it would be a bit of a hot potato. Maybe I'm misdescribing Christian. Our recommendation was to try to keep nuclear power plants available as they are, but we were quite unsure in the numbers when it comes to new development of nuclear power plants. But we definitely think keeping the available nuclear power plants and doing enough maintenance to keep them safe is kind of a bit of a good trade-off, given how necessary the emission reductions are at the moment. Again, we were a bit ambivalent on the future of nuclear because it's a very difficult thing to forecast. And it was quite unclear to us given the numbers that we have. So on subsidies, we emphasize in the report to subsidize electricity storage rather than capture and sequestration, and I'll be more clear in the next slide why we think that's a much better idea. And then other things that will be happening is how to reshape the electricity network with distributed generation versus offshore wind and many other technologies coming out. The no-brainer is to phase out coal, although the very high natural gas prices that we're seeing now will make that a bit harder. But absent the huge natural gas prices, carbon prices are already high enough to make coal uneconomical. Again, during this, at this moment, it's not as clear that carbon prices are high enough to make coal uneconomic. But even with current natural gas prices, replacing coal is one of the cheapest ways in which to abate emissions, even if it's a bit more expensive than maybe at the time we wrote the report. So our recommendation is to very quickly phase out coal and take this extremely seriously. In some ways, we need, to me, we need a convention at the highest level possible to agree on how that's gonna happen. And again, the carbon price in itself is already a healthy price that should make coal uneconomical, except that we are seeing these extremely high natural gas prices. That said, in Europe, quite a lot of good news. We probably are not phasing out coal rapid enough, but it's definitely happening. And that's kind of one good aspect of carbon pricing. The carbon pricing we already have in place. Finally, we emphasize the need for more flexible demand. This is very important as it can be efficient. It can help accommodate renewables into the grid. And this can be provided at a scale, maybe not by any individual household, but if you put together several households, you start seeing some response. And definitely at the commercial and industrial level, you can provide some response for fluctuations of renewables. But more and more being prepared for demand flexibility will be important for extreme events. We are seeing this quite a bit more in the US than in Europe, but we are witnessing extreme events in which the system cannot produce enough electricity and oftentimes fails. So having this demand that is able to adjust in a safe manner will be important. We do cover other sectors, as I mentioned, although maybe not with as much detail, given that the report is finite. I wanted to have a few words on R&D because this is crucial to solve the global problem, although we definitely cannot hope or wait for it to happen. We need to put a lot of, we need to throw a lot of money into R&D, and then still it might not happen, but we definitely need to keep throwing resources at R&D. We need these technologies dearly because, as Christian already mentioned, we have been growing in emissions. We have not even flattened or gone down. So we need these technologies to prevent further global growth in emissions, but probably even more importantly, to start cutting global emissions. In the future, many reports suggest that we should go globally negative in our emissions. And honestly, we do need huge technological innovation for that to be even feasible. So we highlight in the report key areas for public support. And here we do emphasize that for public subsidies, it would be better to focus on technologies that are non-fossil fuel based. These are the only technologies that are incentive compatible for non-compliant countries. So if a country does not want to reduce their emissions, we better make the non-emitting technologies cheaper than fossil fuels. And here we highlight some technologies like a smaller footprint and cheaper batteries, and also more efficient renewables that can continue to grow. One example of why this is important is Africa. Many countries in Africa do not have reliable sources of fossil fuels. So renewables are already very cost effective there. So we need to make sure that they are definitely cost effective, and that these countries, which are expected to grow, are not growing on fossil fuel capital investments. When it comes to negative emissions, again, it's key to solve the problem, given that truly going zero seems extremely hard. And in this sense, negative emissions, I guess in the report we talk a bit more detail about them. They need to be scalable. So we need to think about, there are so many tons of CO2 already in the atmosphere that we need to think of solutions that are scalable, that can grow massively without threatening other aspects. Obviously, some people focus on forestry, but forestry sometimes is extremely hard to quantify. the true negative emissions that we're getting. So we also highlight focusing on direct air capture technologies, but again, keeping in mind that these solutions need to be scalable. On the European Union, here we kind of write something like a COVID-like international effort to solve this huge problem. Finally, we also highlight R&D that has been done and will continue to be done to improve energy efficiency. So a great success example is LEDs and how they have contributed to the flattening of electricity consumption in Europe and the United States. So anything that can reduce our energy needs will make the transition easier. I was giving you the example of the electricity sector, how the electricity sector needs to be decarbonized, but also at the time that it's growing to absorb other sectors. To the extent that we can reduce the demand that goes into the electricity sector, that transition will be easier. Finally, we do touch on the role for climate activism. In the report, we are a bit skeptical about it, highlighting that it cannot fall on the shoulders of climate activism to solve this problem. Obviously, any pressure that we can put on financial actors is probably at the margin. Why not? But it's hard to see how voluntary mechanisms or pressure coming from consumers will replace a more explicit carbon price. Definitely, we think that responsible investors should already be pricing in carbon. But again, the extent to which they will be pricing in carbon will come from the credibility of those creating explicit carbon pricing policies. We also worry about some of the problems of divestment strategies. There was this week an important announcement of Harvard divesting from fossil fuels, I believe, early this week. But they are divesting, but someone else isn't. So it's kind of a bit of a slow process, and we need definitely something faster than that. We also talk about something that tends to be very popular, which is carbon labeling and footprint labeling. It's extremely hard to put a label on the exact carbon that's contained in a product, but this seems to be, again, quite popular as a label. Similar challenges come from CBAMs. So when we do carbon border adjustment mechanisms, there will be a big discussion on how to properly tax the carbon contained in imports. So we do believe there is some value in making that a bit better. We believe that the pure labeling, we are a bit skeptical about it. But on the other hand, once the labeling is in process and once there's a discussion on how better account for carbon, that might open the door to more easily priced carbon that's embedded in many, many products that as of now might be hard to keep track of. So these are just some thoughts on where we see these type of policies that, again, are quite popular, but in part they are quite popular because they don't have a lot of bite. So that's kind of our report. I don't know if I'm on time like Christian, but this is kind of where we wanted to open the discussion. We look forward to your questions and your feedback.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating to get this from a sort of non-UK perspective, which is what we obviously see a lot of here. And there's a lot of similarities in the debate, and a lot of similarities indeed in terms of where progress is being made. I mean, in the UK, as in France and much of the EU, it is very much in the power sector where we're making progress, and very much in the vehicle sector and the household heating sector, possibly worse in the UK than elsewhere, where we're really not making progress. And it's also very interesting to see the central role of a carbon price, but the need for additional policies on top. And that's, I think, probably one of the areas, perhaps we'll come on to this, where how one draws conclusions about what to put on top of the carbon price and where to deviate from it. Because I think we agree that the carbon price by itself isn't going to do the trick, but it needs to do as much of the heavy lifting as it can. We might come back to, I might come back at the end to ask you both about how to think about that issue of the role of different instruments and how to put them together. But before I do that, let me actually do what I should do and ask some of the questions that people have put into the Slido. I think there's several questions about carbon pricing, actually. So one of them is about how you give certainty about future carbon pricing so as to give the sorts of certainty that infrastructure investments really need. One of you like to have a go at the sort of, it's a sort of political economy question as much as anything else. I mean, how does one give confidence in the future of carbon pricing? Because it's certainly the case that confidence is required for the big infrastructure investments that we do need.
Do you allow me to start on this? Yes, it's a critically important topic. I mean, the fact that there has been high volatility on the carbon price on the EU ETS is not very helpful. It does not provide the security and the degree of certainty is not the good word, because we don't want certainty. It's clear that entrepreneurs need to bear some of the risk associated to the energy transition, which technology will be successful, which technology will fail. We don't know yet. It will be it will require much time to resolve this uncertainty. But at the same time, we know that when there is such high degree of uncertainty, that will limit the incentive for the green entrepreneur to do what should be done. So that's why we suggested a carbon price floor on the EU ETS. It's mean that we could overshoot in the long run the objective, but it's a cost to pay in order to introduce some degree of to reduce the degree of uncertainty and organize some form of risk sharing between the green entrepreneur and the society as a whole. We alternatively, we also suggested something that I've been working on with Jacques Delplat for some time now, which is remember, I mean, the problem is the credibility of the macro policy, of the climate policy in the long run. We face exactly the same credibility problem when we try to fight inflation in the 80s, and the solution that economists have suggested is creating a new institution or giving independency from political influence to a central bank, which would receive the control of the supply of money. So the idea is to use, and it has been quite successful. We fought inflation quite successfully, and that is it's very credible for most stakeholders on financial markets. So we suggest that either a carbon price floor or creating in Europe a carbon central bank, which would be controlled by scientists, climatologists, maybe some economists, who would receive the mandate, democratic mandate from the Union to control the supply of CO2 emission permit, and who would receive the mandate to control the supply of that in order to be compatible with the last scientific knowledge and technological information about the cost and benefits of fighting climate change. We didn't go very far in that direction. Particularly, we should have talked about the governance of that carbon central bank, but that's an alternative idea to a carbon price floor.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mar? I mean, it's interesting. There's also a question in the chat about why you went for, given the uncertainty that's inevitable in a trading system, why you went for more a trading system with a price floor rather than relying on a tax.
So this is for the same reason that we didn't push too far on the central bank, because we consider these unlikely outcomes within the EU. So I think a clear carbon tax that has an aggressive increasing path would be wonderful, but we kind of worked again back to the political feasibility of climate policy. Mm-hmm. We just didn't want to propose something that we considered completely unviable to begin with. It's great that the EU ETS started in 2005. And yes, it started with a bit of a failed trial phase, but it's in place and we can modify it accordingly. A carbon tax is not in place. So that was why we didn't even mention it too much, but we definitely, I think I can speak for Christian as well, and he did mention it, a carbon price would be, a carbon tax, not an uncertain carbon price would be preferred. California got into a bit of trouble because they put a carbon floor and they put a bit of a carbon ceiling, so a floor and a ceiling to the price. But naturally, if you make the floor and the ceiling close enough, that's a carbon tax. So California got into a bit of trouble by putting a floor and a ceiling that were clearly basically trying to mimic a tax. So that's again going back to these challenges.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, that in a way takes us to the next question as well, which is what are the main differences between your recommendations and what we're planning in the UK? I mean, my take on what you have been saying was that in one sense, it's very familiar to UK ears. We're, certainly looking at our own UK ETS, as you say, not ideal that it's outside of the EU trading scheme, to put it mildly. We've got many of the same problems in getting a consistent carbon price across the economy, and certainly I would say that the big differences between the recommendations and what we're actually doing are probably not so different to the big differences between your recommendations and what's happening in the EU. In other words, we do not have anything approaching a single carbon price. We're actually at the IFS going to be putting out some more work on that within the next 2 or 3 weeks, which, to I think no one's surprise, will show that the carbon price within electricity, for example, is much higher than the carbon price, which is effectively charged on the use of gas in domestic circumstances. The effective carbon price on different forms of plane tickets are extremely different, and carbon prices faced by households and industry are extremely different. So my take on this is that there is a big gap still between the need for anything approaching a consistent carbon price across the UK, at least, and where we are in practice. Beyond that, a lot of the issues around support for R&D, the use of feed-in tariffs, the use of regulation, for example, outlawing new fossil fuel-driven cars by 2030, and so on, feel to me, at least in direction of argument, very similar to what you were saying. But I'd be really interested, Mar and Christian, in your, to the extent that you're familiar with UK policy, the extent to which you think what you've been saying applies equally in the UK, and also where you think we may be further ahead or further behind.
Yeah, no, I guess several points, I think. So on the issue of the mispricing of different sectors, this is one of the things we directly highlighted to President Macron in our meeting with him. It's really a problem that you are seeing these extremely high electricity prices while implicitly subsidizing natural gas heating, because it makes the electrification of heating in the homes a really hard thing to sell. So that's one thing we highlighted. In the report, we do suggest, although again, we don't emphasize because we don't consider it maybe as feasible, to directly, to me, the easiest would be to directly tax fossil fuels before they get burned. So now the approach is that you tax people when they burn fossil fuels, but it would be much easier from a regulatory point of view and also from a fairness point of view to tax to tax fossil fuels in advance when they get produced and they can be sold and burned. We can already tax them. We know how much CO2 will go in there from their consumption. But that again, it's probably not feasible. It would really simplify regulation. So when thinking about jet fuel, it's very easy. Just tax the jet fuel before it goes inside the plane, and that will do it. But again, it's kind of for lobby reasons. I believe it's a very fragmented type of discussion, and that makes it much less efficient. When it comes to the UK, to be honest, I don't know the specifics of UK policy very well, but I do think of the UK as kind of, at least in the electricity context, as one of the countries to pay attention to, because its decarbonization has been really quite dramatic and inspiring, I would say. But I do not know the details that probably make you enraged sometimes, happy some other times. I am not familiar with kind of the sad story or the maybe happy story behind it.
Yeah, maybe I could add one thing to that picture. I mean, there are several reasons. I mean, there is an efficiency reason why we want to have a single price on carbon. It's efficiency, but it's also because of transparency and resistance to lobbies. I mean, when you impose a uniform price on carbon, I mean, it's hard to come with your special example. Oh, I should get an exemption when you are the only one to ask for an exemption. I mean, so that's the resistance to lobbies seems to be quite important in France, and I believe in the UK too. Something else. I mean, I have been quite surprised since I work on this field of climate policies to feel how people underestimate the impact of price on their way of life. I mean, the people do not understand that having a larger price on energy affects in the long run the way they live. And so the simple example is cars in Europe and the US. You have a much larger price on gasoline in Europe than in the US, and in the long run you see the difference in terms of the type of car you sell on the market. Whereas in France, many people are telling me, in particular since July the 14th, when the Fit for 55 project was presented by the Commission, saying, why do we need a carbon price on transportation cars? Because most people will not change. They need a car, and they will continue to use their car even if the price of gasoline is larger. But they do not realize that in the long run they will change their way of life. They will probably, some of them will move their location. Others will purchase a lighter car in the long run. And so politicians, for example, Pascal Canfin, who is a French politician, he is a European representative for France in Strasbourg and Brussels. He says, no, he's against the ETS2, this second market for permit for the transportation and buildings, because he says, we have all those people, they cannot change their way of their mobility, and it's not true. So I believe you have the same kind of. We have even economists in France saying we should discriminate carbon price because in some sectors the price elasticity of the demand for energy is different than in others. We should start to use the price signals in sectors where the price elasticity of the demand for energy is larger, which make no sense to me, but it's indeed an issue.
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of issues. I think your point about the long run impacts of carbon prices and people changing their behavior is really important. But I think within that, you capture the political problem, of course, which is in the short run, many people really can't change their behavior. And so you do end up with people feeling worse off. And I think from a UK perspective, it'd be really quite interesting to get your reflection in that context on the sort of Gilets jaunes sort of protests and so on that you've had a couple of years ago, because I think a number of people here sort of saw that as a bit of a warning against increasing prices in a way that was not getting public support, and I think has worried some people in the context of losing support for climate change policies.
Yes, clearly in France, this Yellow Vest movement 2 years ago is playing a big role still today, not only in climate policy, but in different dimensions, which introduce a lot of conservatism when people have live in a utopia of, in this and that dimension. It's very difficult to sell policies that are improving welfare, but people believe it doesn't improve welfare. In France, for example, we have analysis by my colleagues from PSC that shows that people vastly overestimate the impact of the tax on their purchasing power, and they don't believe politicians that promise to compensate the increase in the carbon tax by a green check. So this kind of problem is quite difficult for a politician these days. And one last point on this: when I talk to people outside France, I strongly feel that this Yellow Vest movement that took place in France is in the mind of many politicians, and I think it will be very difficult for Brussels to sell this Fit for 55, because I see in many European countries people feeling that if we introduce a carbon price on transportation sector, they will have to confront themselves with the Yellow Vest movement too, and so I'm to tell you the truth, I'm quite skeptical, and in fact I'm quite pessimistic. That's exactly a way of representing my feeling today on this. I'm pessimistic about the ability of Brussels to sell the package, and in particular, I'm crazy with France. I mean, France already has a carbon price on transportation. We have this carbon tax, 44 euros per ton of CO2. That was frozen by Macron due to the Yellow Vest movement. We have already that price. So introducing a price at the European level will be neutral for France, because I believe that we will just substitute the carbon tax by this European scheme. So for the French people, it will be irrelevant. But we are exporting with this transformation. We induce other countries to have a carbon price on their transportation sector, and so it's crazy. I'm going to see Pompili, our Ministry of Ecology in France tomorrow, and I will try to explain to her that it's too bad that France is against the Fit for 55, whose one of the main dimensions is introducing carbon pricing in transportation. It's crazy for France to go against that, because we already have it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take on some of the political problems. Again, I might sort of ask at the end about your degree of optimism or pessimism in a more general sense about whether we, as in both the UK and the rest of Europe, will actually get to net zero by 2050. But I did want to ask first. I mean, you mentioned carbon border adjustment mechanisms. I wonder how far you've gone in looking at how feasible that would be beyond 2 or 3 of the very obvious sectors, like maybe cement and steel, and the extent to which you think that's feasible for a wide range of consumer goods, because that's something that in principle, obviously a carbon border adjustment feels like a vital thing to go alongside internal carbon taxes, and certainly in the UK context, whilst our territorial emissions have gone down by something like 45% over the last 30 years, our consumption emissions have gone down by only about something less than 30% over that period. And so if we're not going to deal with imported carbon, we're not going to reduce our carbon footprint in the way that we need to. And an obvious concomitant of an internal carbon price is a carbon border adjustment. But the practical issues do seem to me to be really quite severe if one goes beyond a small number of big ticket items. I just wonder how far you got in looking at the practicability of that.
So, Paul, in the report, we do not have much on how difficult that would be when it comes to the real detail. I have done work myself in trying to quantify these emissions, and obviously one challenge is the data. It's very hard to get a sense of what the emissions contained in any given import. To the extent that that measurement contains error, it opens the door for litigation in the context of tariffs and whether those international tariffs are fair. Obviously, the current situation is not fair. We are subsidizing imports by not properly taxing their carbon content in the same way that we do inland. But this is not how it might be perceived internationally. It also doesn't help that the United States is talking about putting a carbon border adjustment without even having carbon pricing in their own territory, because that definitely makes it not necessarily a fair tariff. So I think in the context of Europe and the UK is extremely justifiable, but it's very easily criticized because of the measurement concerns. You cannot come up with a perfect bulletproof measurement of the imports of the emissions of an imported good. And again, it opens the door to litigation. That said, it might be feasible to put some tariff that might not tax the whole the whole carbon content, but that it's low enough that no firm can claim that they have lower emissions than that, and therefore at least you tax a little bit of that content. So probably the final solution will have a bit of this flavor that everyone can claim to be clean enough, where clean is probably way clearer than they are, but at least you tax some of it. Yeah.
Maybe two additional things. First, it was in my slide, but I forgot to mention it. We consider, and that was under the suggestion of other members of the Commission, saying the CBAM is second best. The first best is trying to negotiate with our trade partners, a climate coalition or something like that, and having the CBAM as a treat in case we do not succeed in creating this this coalition. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make, I agree this is very difficult. Carbon accounting is still in its infancy, and it will be, in particular, even within the European Union, and exporting a carbon accounting system outside in order to estimate the cost, the carbon content of different products is extremely difficult. But keep in mind that given the target, given the ambition, the European ambition and the UK ambition, the carbon price will have to be at that high level that I mentioned in the slide. If we do not get the problem of carbon leakage on board, there will be a big issue with what's the net benefit of doing all those sacrifices in Europe if globally we do not change the carbon footprint because we just import the carbon we do not emit on the continent. So meaning we need to address the carbon leakage problem. We need to do something about that. If we don't, we will not be able to increase the carbon price at the level compatible with the European ambition, so this is a difficult issue.
Yeah, so maybe I want to piggyback on that comment from Christian. So it's very different to local pollution. So in some sense, we have already experienced leakage. Many jobs went away from the economies that were developing first because people didn't like dirty air. So let's face it, we shipped dirty production outside of our countries. We did lose jobs in the process, but we did improve air quality. So in that context of local pollution, you do lose jobs, but you see a bit of a more direct benefit that's kind of more easily explained. with a global problem like climate change, it's really not a pollution problem. So in the local sense, so in that sense, you are losing jobs, you see no benefits. If anything, we are in for already a lot of climate damage that will keep increasing no matter what we do. So politicians will keep seeing increases in extreme events, increases in very dire conditions, and will have to claim that whatever they are doing that's losing jobs is helping. So addressing the leakage problem is in some sense much more important than maybe what happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we were pushing away dirty stuff that we didn't want in-house.
That is clearly a really important issue. And I guess one of the political issues is that all of the targets are about territorial emissions. They're not actually about consumption emissions, and actually, in as ever, targets matter because they drive behavior and they make people forget about other things that potentially really do matter. We're running towards the end here. I guess I did want to end with the question about your degree of optimism, really, about what's happening in France and what's happening in the rest of the EU. And do you think, how much traction are your recommendations getting, is the first question about optimism. And the second one is about whether you think France and or the European Union will actually get to net zero by 2050.
Christian is waiting for me to go first. So
ladies first, but if you want, I can start.
No, that's fine. I think it depends on the day. Some days it is honestly hard to be optimistic about this because it's such a large problem. The current natural gas price crisis, it makes many technologies a no-brainer. So in that sense, we will see decarbonization even if people don't want it. But let's see what the trends are. In terms of policy, again, I think these policies are popular until they aren't. So we'll see when we hit that kind of constraint. Already today, the Spanish government announced that they will be limiting the increases in electricity prices and passing that debt to future generations, as if we had not passed enough debt to future generations. So it will be very difficult, but I do think we need to, I think in some ways how bad things will get will make it also easier, because I think at this point no one can claim that they are not noticing the impacts of climate change directly on their lives. So I think that will be kind of a little bit the saving grace, that at some point people demand this because the costs of inaction are felt. But obviously that will be a tad late to be a bit to understate the problem. Yeah.
So my take on this question is following. First, over the last 10 years, we had a lot of good news, not on the behavioral dimension, but on the technologies. Mar is always telling me, the cost of producing kilowatt hours with photovoltaic panel has been reduced so much that now it's cost efficient to use that technology rather than gas, natural gas or fuel, even without the carbon price. And I take that it's true, and that was not true 5 years ago. It's partly true in different regions of the world today. Well, of course, there is the intermittency problem, but we are working on that. So first, one source of optimism is technological, but clearly we cannot rely on this optimism to base the solution. So the second source of optimism is, I feel the profession is more involved. I mean, us economists, we speak with the common voice. So there has been different statements in the US, in Europe, by our profession to say carbon pricing plus carbon border adjustment, and plus this and that with redistribution. So we are speaking one voice. I hope to convince scientific societies like the Royal Societies or the European Economic Association to make a similar statement. That would be helpful. And finally, look, the Fit for 55 is not perfect, but it's going in the right direction. I mean, if we do that, if Brussels is able to convince the 27 members of the Union to implement, I mean, to accept the package, that is radical transformation. It's really doing something. And you see the market, the EU ETS, starting to realize that maybe the Fit for 55 will be implemented. But of course, there are national egoism are still there, and we will see what happens. I hope that every country that rejects one part of the EU ETS, the Fit for 55 package, will have to submit an alternative policy to compensate for not doing this or that, but or recognize that 55% reduction by the year 2030 is not feasible. I hope that the negotiation will be made on that basis. Otherwise, we will have difficulty. But yes, okay. 2 years ago, when I wrote my book, Le climat après la fin du mois, I was very pessimistic. It was at the middle of the Yellow Vest movement, and I was completely disappointed. I was close to depression. But since July the 14 and the European package of the Green Deal, there is something here, and there we realize that our profession has been quite successful in providing a solution.
Well, I think that's probably an excellent note to end on. I was actually giving a talk last night on an entirely different topic, and as ever, I was being a bit miserable about stuff, and I got a question from someone in the audience asking whether economists ever said anything cheerful. But I do feel reasonably optimistic about where we are in the UK on this. I don't know whether we'll get exactly to net zero by 2050, but I'm pretty confident we'll get a long way towards it for a lot of the reasons that you're describing in the European context as well. Thank you, Mar. Thank you, Christian. That's been just a fantastic overview of your work and really interesting, as I say, from a UK perspective. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and do remember that the third in our series of these three will be next Tuesday or Wednesday. Let me just check which day that is next week. That will be next Wednesday, looking at demographic challenges. So I think it's probably time we stop. So thank you again to everyone.